Now let's take a look at the address resolution protocols, ARP and RARP. Here, device A with an address of 10.1.1.1 wants to send a packet to device B 10.1.1.2. Here's what the packet is going to look like. He wants to send data over there. And here's the layer 2 portion. There's source MAC address and destination MAC address. Source and destination. The layer 3 information is right here. So his IP address for the source 10.1.1.1 and then the IP address for the destination 10.1.1.2. The problem is, even though device A knows its own MAC address, remember we'll simplify the MAC address and abbreviate it by simply saying AA for A's MAC address. Device A knows his own MAC address and he knows the IP address of the other device here, but he does not have a MAC address to put in the destination field here. So what device A does is sends out a broadcast onto the wire, onto the network, saying, who is 10.1.1.2? Whose IP address is this? Device B hears that ARP, that broadcast, and sends back his own MAC address. He sends back a reply, an ARP reply. So there's the ARP request coming from device A, and there's the ARP reply coming from device B with the MAC address. So what ARP is, Address Resolution Protocol, ARP maps a layer 3 address that we know to a layer 2 address that was unknown. So a layer 2 address that was unknown. We'll abbreviate that by just simply saying BB for the MAC address there. So this is what we do with ARP. It's the mapping of layer 3 address to a layer 2 address. Now what happens if device A is wanting to send a packet to a device that's not on its local network? This is where we come into the concept of what we call proxy ARP. Here we've got a router connected to another network, and here's another device over here, device C, and device C's IP address is 20.1.1.2. So he's on a different network, has a different network ID. So instead back here, device A wants to send this packet now to a device on another network over here. What happens is now device A, when he sends out an ARP broadcast, remember with ARP being a broadcast, if it hits this router, even though this router knows about how to get to network 20 over here from network 10 over here, the router is not going to forward any broadcast because routers are the broadcast boundary. Routers do not forward broadcasts. So what the router does instead, when the router hears this broadcast that says, who is 20.1.1.2? What the router does is the router says, I am 20.1.1.2. So the router sends back that ARP reply to device A. So the router responds with its own MAC address, RR. And so now, instead of forwarding it on to device C over here, the router sends back his own MAC address. And so whenever device A wants to send this packet now, device A is going to populate the destination MAC address field with the router's MAC address. This is what we call proxy ARP, where the router stands in as a proxy to this other network. It's an intermediate device for this other network. So that now, if this packet is sent to the router gets this packet, sees its own MAC address here, but the router sees the other network where this packet is needing to go. The router strips off this portion right here and then rebuilds the layer 2 information by putting his own MAC address in the source field and putting the MAC address of the receiving device, the layer 2 MAC address of device C over here, in the destination field, and the router then routes and forwards that packet onto device C. That's proxy ARP. Now, there's one other concept to take a look at that fits in this ARP family, and that is reverse ARP. Remember, I mentioned ARP is the mapping of a known layer 3 address to an unknown layer 2 address. Well, if that's ARP, then reverse ARP is where we would take these two and we would reverse them. So we know a layer 2 address and we need a layer 3 address. What happens with reverse ARP, this device right here, device A, says, well, I know my MAC address and I need an IP address. So the PC sends out a RARP request, a reverse ARP request, sends out a request and says, here's my MAC address, AA, what is my IP address? Sends out a request saying, what is my IP address? Another device on the network, some type of server, would send back a reply saying, here is your IP address. Your IP address is supposed to be 12.1.1.1. This is your IP address. Sends that back. This is called reverse ARP. We commonly refer to this in networking as DHCP. This is the same type of thing that we're doing with DHCP, where there's a layer 2 address that's known. I know my MAC address. I need an IP address. So that RARP request or DHCP request is sent out onto the wire. A DHCP server responds and says, here's an IP address that you can use. So RARP, Reverse Address Resolution Protocol, is the mapping of a layer 2 address to a layer 3 address. So that's a look at the address resolution protocols, ARP and RARP, as well as a look at proxy ARP. ARP, Address Resolution Protocol, is the mapping of a layer 2 address to a layer 3 address.